into this info session, and let me dive into the idea around mainstreaming democratic rights-centric education. And in this, just to sort of start off with a few preambles, let's say, I'm here considering that democratic is more or less the same thing as being centered on human rights, from the angle that, well, some people understand democratic to mean that we have a system of representative government, and I would say the democratic means much more than that. For example, just because you have a system of elections and you can elect a president, that doesn't automatically mean a democracy, because if the people who criticize that elected leader disappear, then that's quite a problem. And this was a reality in Sri Lanka fairly recently, right? Democratic also can't just be assumed from the title. So we had the German Democratic Republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and generally we would not consider those to be very democratic societies. So I would say the democratic as an adjective is a way of life based on certain loosely defined ideals like dignity, freedom, participation, equality, and exactly what those ideals are vary somewhat. So you have different indices evaluating the quality of democracy of different countries, and they use somewhat different benchmarks, right? But the most fundamental laws that define what it is to be a democratic society, those ideals are enshrined in human rights laws. So these could be domestic, like constitutional law, or like a Bill of Rights, or they can be international in terms of human rights treaties that countries have ratified. So for example, going back to that representation and voting, one of the key principles of democracy is that of equality. So if we are voting, then each person's vote has to have the same value. And this wasn't always the case in history, where we had systems where richer people had more votes. I mean, you could argue that that sort of is the case now as well, but at least on paper, it's not. At least on paper, everybody's vote is the same. But there's still question marks around whether everybody can vote. So in some countries, if you are in prison, you can't vote. In some countries, if you happen to be abroad, like the situation in Sri Lanka, you can't vote, whereas other countries have certain provisions. So how well people can exercise their franchise varies. So in that sense, democratic is not a binary. We can't say these are democratic countries and these are not democratic or totalitarian countries. Rather, every country has opportunities to improve. Hopefully they are always improving, but it's not always the case. And sometimes the human rights record worsens. And there actually is a mechanism by which countries report regularly on their compliance with international human rights treaties that that country has ratified. Like I think every 4 or 5 years, for every major treaty they have ratified, there is a reporting mechanism. So here, up to now, this is democratic in a broader sense of how we would understand the term if somebody said we live in a democracy. So what does it mean if we look at this in education? So some parallels here, right? So democratic doesn't mean only that there are decisions based on students voting, right? I mean, generally speaking, if students are voting on something, that would mean there's more participation than if they couldn't vote on it. But just the fact that students are voting on some things, I think would not qualify description as democratic, and especially if those decisions are very trivial decisions, or if you can't speak freely against something because you're afraid that there will be recriminations, like if you speak against this, your grades are going to suffer, something like that. If your freedom of expression is not protected, then your voting doesn't really mean much. And again, the title also doesn't quite mean anything. I mean, any school could call themselves a democratic school, and is there a way to decide if they're democratic, and even who should be deciding this, right? I mean, even in that earliest example of North Korea, I mean, can I sitting in Sri Lanka, or let's say Delhi sitting in England, decide whether North Korea is actually democratic or not? Maybe it's actually the people in North Korea who should be saying that, right? And if we apply that argument to schools, then if a school is calling itself democratic, um, and actually, even if it is not calling itself democratic, still the people in the school should be the ones who are saying, is the way things happen around here aligned with democratic ideals or not? So, where we have people who say they are in democratic education, like democratic societies, it's based again on certain loosely defined ideals like autonomy or self-direction uh, or participation, but it is not coded in any standardized way. I mean, for example, UDEC has a certain definition of democratic education. SD has certain descriptions of self-directed education, but there is, I mean, if you're a member of UDEC, you will accept their definition. If you're part of SD, you'll maybe accept their definition, but there isn't a consistent acceptance for this. There isn't really a standard that everybody agrees on with this. And just like in countries, even in education, democratic can't be a binary. We can't, for example, say that because Summerhill is organized on democratic ideals for more than a century, it is the gold standard for a democratic school, or Sudbury Valley, or any place really, right? I would rather see that all of them have areas where they're doing well, and all of them have opportunities to improve, even in an area that they're doing well. But there really isn't a mechanism to support this. I mean, there is some voluntarily sharing when we meet at conferences, and sometimes there are books and things like that, or online sessions, but there isn't really a strong mechanism to support this sharing. So I'm borrowing here a bit of terminology from Don Berg, where he talks of the technical aspect, the political aspect, and the marketing aspect. And in the last week's call on the Making Change Stick program, I think he had referred to this concept of right-centric education as being part of the political side of things, right? So one of the things with the idea behind right-centric education is that there isn't like a centralized body that decides what can and cannot be done, as long as it is aligned with the objective of the network. People can do things, and if other people see value in it, then they will participate in it. So this is not meant to be the one and only thing that right-centric education is doing, but this is, let's say, a proposal for how we can tackle the political problem. And this initiative or program can exist with other initiatives that are going on in parallel. So the people who want to work on this would work on this. People who want to work on the other ones would work on the other ones. And hopefully find ways in that for all of us to help each other in our larger objective. So I would describe the present situation that there are many stakeholders, whether this is like children, parents, teachers, administrators, policymakers, human rights organizations, past pupils, employers, who are dissatisfied with the presently mainstream system of schooling. In this, of course, education is much more than schooling, but still, schools are where most children presently receive their education. And I say that they are structurally violent, right? Now, there's be a bit of a question on this because, like, what authority do I have to say that schools are structurally violent, right? But we'll come to that in a bit. And many of these dissatisfied stakeholders, whether they're in education, whether they're in the mainstream public schools, whether they're in alternative schools, whether those are identified as democratic or by some other term, whether they're in home education, or whether they're people outside the implementation, like people like UNESCO, UNICEF, a lot of them are trying to improve things. There are many, many wonderful ideas and practices. But this mainstream system is so big and it's so powerful, and the people who are trying to make these changes are too fragmented. So the mainstream still pretty much continues the way it has for the last few centuries. Some cosmetic changes are maybe made, but fundamental changes don't seem to happen. And uh, although we say many people are trying to improve things, and I think many people believe they are trying to improve things, whether this is actually an improvement or not is still a question mark, right? So one of the reasons why governments are somewhat skeptical about home education is, what if the reason the child is not being sent to school is because this is an abusive household? And if the child went to school, there would be mandatory reporting, and therefore you don't let the child go to school. Like, I think it was earlier this year, there was the case in the US, I think in well, somewhere on the East Coast, where this child, now an adult, had been like detained at home in a room for like 20 years or something like that, right? And this had been a case where the child had been to school, then stopped going to school, and fallen through the cracks, and it wasn't discovered that this kind of thing was going on. And uh, the existence of these kind of things, no matter how isolated they might mean that there is a need for some kind of state oversight in order to protect the rights of people. Um, and to take another example, uh, Jonathan Haidt would have schools ban all smartphones and social media, at least until a certain age. And while I would agree that there are issues around how smartphones and social media are being used by children, just like there are issues around how they're used by adults. And this requires some well, careful attention. It can't just be a free for all. The idea that you could just ban things without any participation by children in that decision, and without considering all the ways in which devices support child rights, like as has been stated in a general comment about how it supports the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of expression, the right to be heard, the right to play. So there are many rights that the digital space is pivotal in fulfilling. And if you just ban it, then you're ignoring all those rights. So I would argue that Hyde's approach to this is not an improvement, but many systems seem to think it is, right? So again, this question of says who, right? Jonathan Haidt has written a best-selling book, I Haven't, so who wins in this he said kind of contest, right? Anyway, so we have this political problem, and what we need is some kind of standard by which an improvement can be evaluated. Like, is this actually an improvement? In what way is it an improvement, or is it actually an area of concern? And whatever the standard needs to be something that is well articulated, because it has to be like tight enough to not be some wishy-washy statement that nobody can grasp onto, but it has to be broad or general enough so that you can allow for nuanced implementation in different contexts. And there has to be some sort of universal acceptance of this, right? So if I, or let's say Derry or Richard goes up and says something that this is a problem because of this, then it shouldn't be a case that this government can just ignore it on the basis like, who are you to say this, right? If there isn't a strong acceptance of the standard, then it won't work. And then we need a means by which these improvements can be mainstream. And I think it was in James's session that he talked about how much time it was taking for improvements in practices in one hospital to be mainstreamed in other hospitals and how that needs to be speeded up. So just like that, if there is some idea or practice that is implemented in one school that is advancing in terms of this reference, then ideally it should be taken to as many other schools as possible as quickly as possible. Right? And how can those who are working on this implement each other? So when we look at it this way, it seems like it's a big ask, but actually that standard already exists, right? So international human rights law exists as a standard. And if this law can underpin a democratic society, it can underpin every aspect of that society, including education, right? And these are ratified by governments, which means, which unfortunately doesn't mean that it automatically happens, but it means that citizens can hold them accountable to, as they say in rights terminology, respect, protect, and advance those rights. It's harder for a government to just ignore something when it can be shown to be part of a treaty that the government has ratified. And they are well articulated. So in terms of the actual law, if you take the UNCRC, there are quite defined, definite statements. And then those are elaborated in general comments where it looks at one or more of those rights and explains what does this mean here, what does this mean there, like what does the right to be heard mean in education and things. And there are many other UN declarations and programs that can support this. So I would say that any in a school that calls itself democratic, any useful practice that they have that is respectful of democratic principles can be shown to be aligned to one or more articles in international human rights law. And if it can't, if that connection can't be shown, then I would maybe doubt whether this is really a democratic practice. And there has been a proposal to actually evaluate environments. It said specifically schools, but I'm saying it broadly as environments on human rights and to be used as a tool for mainstreaming them has been approved already, right? It was part of this first phase of the World Program for Human Rights Education. That's quite a long document, but the relevant parts of it, sections of it, I've extracted on the wiki website. So if you go to this website, I think there's like starting point, recommended starting points, other starting points, and you'll see this in that second section. And then there's quite a lot of highlights. So I'm not going to go into like specifics of what that program was about or what it entails right now. That can be done later. But the last slide that I prepared is that I think the IDEC conference that's coming up in Belgium in August is a really pivotal opportunity to realize this political solution, because the people coming to IDEC are people who likely have educational practices that are quite well aligned with human rights, even if maybe they don't articulate it that way. So for example, when we have age mixing happening in educational environment compared to forcing children to be in certain groups, usually by age and sometimes by performance, then that's an issue of the right to freedom of association, right? Why can a child not choose which other children they want to be with? Why does that choice have to be like fixed for a year? Why can't it be a lot more variable? and even to the extent of which adults they associate with, because in most systems you cannot choose which teacher uh, you are going to get. So again, when it comes to rights, this doesn't mean that it's a free for all, that anybody can associate with anybody at any time, because then you probably can't run a school. But it doesn't have to be this kind of rigid grouping that is happening in mainstream. So things like age mixing can be articulated in terms of the right to freedom of association. So uh, IDEC organizers have put developing this quality assurance system, which is what it was called in that world program, on the agenda. So there will be a session to introduce it on the second day of the conference, and we can have additional workshops from that day till the end of the conference. The idea being that, well, this kind of quality assurance system, the development of it should also be as participatory as possible. Um, I think people coming to IDEC have a vested interest in making this happen, because most of those environments are struggling to, well, sometimes they're using a lot of their energy defending themselves to state inspectors instead of just getting on with the work that they're doing. They find it difficult to get recognition, which means it's hard to get students to come in, it's hard to get funding to come in. And something like this can, instead of being positioned as like an alternative and being marginalized, rather be seen that, hey, these practices are more aligned with international human rights law than what is happening in the mainstream. So you should be supporting us, and you should be taking these practices into the mainstream schools. And in areas where the mainstream schools are doing better than us, then we should be supported to do them. And one of those key areas is that uh, it's only a publicly funded school that can admit a student regardless of financial capacity, right? And most democratic environments are privately funded, so there is that exclusion based on finance. So there are some areas where mainstream schools are more democratic than democratic schools. So how do we get all of these environments to be more supportive rather than fighting against each other? But I think the people coming to IDEC are the ones who have the most to gain. And so what I'm hoping in this workshop is that we will work out the details of how this quality assurance system is going to work. How are we going to report these things? How are we going to categorize them? Is there going to be some authentication of them? How are we going to keep track of them, make them searchable? How are we going to market this, which then leads a little bit also to the marketing problem that Don was talking about. And in order to have those workshops at the conference running smoothly, my thought is that there needs to be some people who will work on it virtually in this month and the next month. And we had a very similar kind of thing happening with the IDEC resolution back in 2023. There was about 7 of us working virtually. Then me and Henning took it to IDEC, and then there was more work that happened at the conference before we finalized it. So it's something similar to that that I see happening. So that is it as far as the slides are concerned. And now we can see any questions.
Claudia was just wanting to clarify which index you were referring to. And then we've got a nice clarifying question from Max on how to adapt to each country and region.
Right. Indexes in democracies, is it? Or
yes, I think so.
right.
I think it was when you were speaking of, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So I'm aware that Pew Research publishes some kind of ranking of countries, and it's not that they have their own metrics, but they take few, I think Freedom House or something, and can't remember offhand what that is. But there are a few different people who do evaluations of countries on things like how free and fair are their elections, how well are fundamental rights respected, what is the freedom of the press, what is how independent is the judiciary, things like that. And so these are sometimes, I think, used by civil society actors to say, like, our country has gone down in this aspect, we need to strengthen this aspect. So those are indicators, I believe, still based on human rights law, right? Freedom of the press is very much associated with freedom of expression. How to adapt it to different countries and regions. So I think there's maybe two sides to this. So one is, even when it comes to the aims of education, there is an aspect about respect for your own culture. So the practices that would be, let's say, acceptable in Sri Lanka may or may not be acceptable in England and vice versa because of certain cultural differences. So we need to work with those differences. And sometimes these things have certain tensions because sometimes for example, the right to religious freedom can conflict with rights on violence against children, because there's some kinds of violence against children that are justified by religious teachings, right? So there is always contentious aspects like that, but like with any other area in human rights, that isn't like an ongoing back and forth in terms of how to resolve it. But yes, it would need to look at or be considered of different realities. And the other side of it is, if you look at the process by which countries report on human rights treaties, there are certain priorities that they agree to work on, and they report on the work that they've done. So then you also have civil society actors raising certain concerns. So, for example, in some countries, you might have the rights of refugees being a much bigger issue than in some other countries. You might have environmental rights being more issues in some countries than others. So in each country, although all rights apply to all people in all countries, which areas they choose to focus on would depend on what the people in that country consider important. So I would imagine that, for example, if the Sri Lankan public schools were using this, I can imagine that there would be more priority on eliminating corporal punishment than there would be on getting rid of uniforms, saying that uniforms are a violation of freedom of expression, right? So, and I think it also matters in terms of what do the children themselves say. Okay, if it's a school that they feel the corporal punishment is not an issue, then maybe they will work on uniforms or some other aspect. But for the places where the corporal punishment is the issue, then they might prioritize that. So one of the key things in applying this is, because children have a right to be heard, children have a right to freedom of expression, and there is a concept of the evolving capacity of the child. It has to be a participatory process, right? If it's just the school principal saying this is what we're doing and I have now implemented democracy or something like that, that's probably not going to fly.
So there's a nice comment in chat that Alenka has just done some training with the UN, looking on quality based in human rights education. Be good maybe if she can join the working group. What do you envision, Sifan, in terms of this working group, roles, frequency of meeting, just generally letting people have some kind of idea?
I think we would probably have a call either once a week or once in 2 weeks, because it's things move very quickly when people connect on a call. But with the time zones we have, and there was somebody from Australia who was interested but couldn't make it to this call. And so we have like Eastern time in Australia to Pacific time in the US. That's quite a big spread. So it may be that we sort of alternate the timings for each call, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that everybody joins for every call. We'd have some kind of summary after the call, and there would be opportunities maybe also to work in smaller groups, or either by email or Discord or Google Docs. So it wouldn't be really very much dependent on the calls. I'd say that there's some things that would happen in the call, something that would happen out. But what kind of skill set we need for this, I can name a couple of starting things. I think people who have experience interfacing with like school inspectors or school authorities. So, for example, Charlie and Berry, I know have that kind of background, would be useful. I know that there are people in IDEC who have also interface LiDAR, but I'm not sure like exactly who has done what. There would, I think, be also kind of a what kind of technical platform is this going to run on, and how is this going to work? How do we like ensure privacy, integrity, things like that, that side of things. There might be a sort of marketing promotion kind of thing in terms of how are we going to onboard different people into this, how are we going to get the support of human rights agencies, national human rights bodies, education ministries, and things like that. Whether that's something that would start now or not, I'm not sure. These are the kind of areas that I can think of off the top of my head, but maybe there would be more.